Susan Koch, is that the lady?
Yeah, but
I want to ask about if she knows a.
no.
Okay, and I'm going
What?
to mute.
What's
Hi, Judy.
put that into a Susan
You
Koch?
chat if there's a question.
Okay, hello, everybody. I'm Trudy Peterson. I coordinate Village Voices for Capitol Hill Village. Let me start out by saying thank you to a number of people. Judy Berman for doing not only the tech duties tonight, but also, of course, running the village in a way that we all appreciate. Thank you also to Majine Daniels and Karen Struck, who do the publicity for Village Voices, without which nobody would ever know what we are doing. And we're really pleased that they continue to put the Village Voices program into everybody's emails regularly. Also, as Judy just said, we are recording this. So not only please mute yourself, but think about carefully what you want to say when we get to the Q&A. And because we know that people get questions as the speaker speaks, and then they're afraid they're going to forget them by the end of the session, please use the chat function. And Judy and I will monitor the chat all during the session, and I will come back to you if you have something in the chat that has been placed during Susan's talk. So let me also say that there are 2 more sessions of Village Voices before we take our annual summer break. On May 6th, on Tuesday, David Pellizzari, who I think is on this call actually, is going to be talking about collecting rare and valuable books. This is what he has done for a number of people, including members of the village. And if you think you've got valuable books, or if you think you want to buy valuable books, David's the guy you want to listen to. So that will be on Tuesday, May 6th. And then in June, our last program of this spring semester is April Linton. She's president of City Wildlife, but you may know her as the force behind Duck Watch. And if you're looking for ducklings in the city, and especially on Capitol Hill, it's April Linton who's going to try to rescue ducks for you. So those are the things that are coming up, and I'll remind you of them at the end of this program. Now, tonight's program really came about in a couple of ways. One is I noticed that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which does something called the Doomsday Clock, in its January edition of this year, moved it from 90 seconds to midnight to 89 seconds to midnight. That's the closest it has ever been to believing the world is heading to catastrophe, measured by nuclear war, climate change, and disruptive technologies. So we need to think hard about, as the doomsday clock moves and creeps closer to midnight, what is the status of our control of nuclear arms in the United States, and what's its background? And we have with us tonight Susan Koch, who's a specialist in the policy issues along with arms reduction and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. From 82 to 2007, she held a series of senior positions: White House National Security Council staff, Office of Secretary of Defense, Department of State, U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, all looking at nonproliferation and arms reduction policy. So we could not have a better person to tell us what is the background to this move of the doomsday clock. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Trudy, and thank you everybody for joining. This is a real pleasure for me. To give you a sense of how important it is that the doomsday clock is now closer than it's ever been to midnight, is this has been going since 1947. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was set at 7 minutes to midnight. Now we're 89 seconds. The farthest it's ever been from midnight since 1947 was 17 minutes in 1991. We'll be talking a little bit more about 1991 because that was the year that the Soviet Union was dissolved, that the first treaty on strategic nuclear weapons reductions was signed, and the largest reductions were announced by way of informal agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, the decision on where to set the doomsday clock is necessarily subjective. So I don't know if we face a greater danger of nuclear war now than we did in 1962. We certainly, the factors that go into the doomsday clock, to include climate change, emerging technologies, obviously have really changed in those 63 years. But it's absolutely undeniable that the foreseeable nuclear future is of great concern. But as I mentioned when we were chatting before, I'll be talking a lot about history, because there's a lot of history in nuclear arms control, and I just don't know what kind of future there is. The New START treaty between the United States and Russia on strategic weapons reductions is due to expire next February 4th, so less than 10 months from now. Theoretically, it could be extended through treaty amendment, but I find it hard to imagine that the two governments could agree on such an amendment by early February. It's still less that the required 67 senators could vote to consent to ratification of such an amendment. If New START expires on February 4th, as I think is quite likely, that will leave us with no nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia, bilateral agreement, for the first time since the Nixon administration. So meanwhile, China is becoming more and more concerned as its nuclear forces grow and as it consistently refuses to negotiate even just minimal confidence building measures like data exchanges. Now, future looks bleak, but one thing I think we've learned in the decades that I at least have been working arms control issues, and there are 4 of them now, is never to say never, because as things happen in this area that I never believed possible, some really good things that I wouldn't have believed possible, and more recently, some pretty bad ones. So while the nuclear arms control future does not look promising to me, I couldn't be absolutely certain that that's the way it will develop. So what we've achieved. First, just numbers. The U.S. nuclear warhead stockpile peaked in 1967 at 31,255 warheads. The last time there's public data, which is for 2023, and it won't have changed much at all, if at all, since then. In 2023, we had 3,748 warheads. That's an 88% reduction. The Russians, unlike the United States, don't publish their warhead numbers, so we only have estimates. Our estimates is that the Soviets peaked at about 40,000 nuclear warheads in 1986, and now have in the neighborhood of 4,500. Again, massive reduction, but quite a few more warheads than we have, and they have a near monopoly in shorter range nuclear forces, which are the ones that we're most worried about in Ukraine and the rest of Europe. but still, the reductions have been far larger than probably most people realize. I started working arms control in 1982, relatively early in the Reagan administration. Now, in the early years of the Reagan administration, conventional wisdom was that he was very anti-arms control. He just wanted to grow nuclear forces. A couple of pieces of evidence that critics pointed to. One, he opposed the SALT II treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks treaty that President Carter had signed, which he said was, a woefully inadequate treaty. And critics also pointed to Reagan's proposals for strategic and intermediate range nuclear arms control. Those called for unprecedented, extensive, intrusive on-site verification and very ambitious cuts in nuclear forces. The proposal for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, just call it START, saves time, was to reduce greatly strategic nuclear forces on both sides. The proposal for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was to prohibit all ground launch missiles between 500 and 5,500 kilometer range. Critics argued that those proposals were so far reaching that they were designed to be turned down by the Soviets. There was one problem with that argument. The Soviets wound up agreeing. Negotiations were long and hard, but they ended very successfully. Now, a central reason for that success was a fortuitous coincidence. After a lengthy Soviet walkout, the START and INF negotiations resumed in March of 1985. That very same month, a young communist leader named Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. It is very unlikely that the old guard would have accepted the far-reaching START and INF reductions and verifications that Gorbachev accepted. Then that period, starting actually with the INF Treaty, which was signed in 1987, was one of obviously seismic change in US, NATO relations with the Soviet Union. Berlin Wall falls in 1989. The Warsaw Pact disappears in early 1991, as I recall. The US and the Soviet Union cooperated in the first Gulf War in 1991. And then, of course, on December 25th, 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. I don't know if others of you are old enough to have done duck and cover in grade school. I certainly am. And when I was doing duck and cover, it never occurred to me there would be a world without a Soviet Union. So that's the beginning of the never say never, and that the Soviet Union would disappear peacefully without a single shot being fired. Now, INF and START, very far-reaching agreements, but there was still much to come over the next up to 20 years. Some were informal treaties, others informal agreements. Less than a month after Gorbachev and President George H.W. Bush signed the START Treaty in July 1991, hardline Soviet leaders launched a coup against Gorbachev. And they really were leaders. The coup plotters included the vice president, the prime minister, the defense minister, the interior minister, the head of the KGB, the spy service, and the recently retired chief of the general staff was, while no longer in office, also supported the coup. With all that leadership, the coup collapsed in 2 days. largely because of the Soviet people and one Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had a few months earlier in May been elected president of the Russian Republic. First democratic elections in free and fair, as near as we know, in Russian history. Gorbachev was under house arrest at his dacha in Crimea, ironically, Crimea. No communication with the outside in either direction. Yeltsin took over and rallied the people, and including the Soviet troops were massed by the Russian White House, and Yeltsin, as I recall, climbed on one of the tanks. The Soviet troops, those tanks were ordered to fire on the protesters, and they refused. The coup collapsed right away. So you could say that this was just almost comic, a 2-day coup. But it definitely reinforced belief in the weakness of the Soviet Union and expectations that it would soon collapse. President Bush, remember this is George H.W., was deeply concerned that the Soviet government's weakness and its likely imminent collapse could result in massive nuclear proliferation. For that reason, above all, in September of 1991, he proposed a series of what we call unilateral reciprocal measures for arms reductions, particularly in shorter range forces, which were the ones, the small stuff, that posed the greatest proliferation threat and were not subject to any formal arms control treaties, any constraints. These unilateral reciprocal meant the United States said, we're going to make these reductions unilaterally, but we urge the Soviet Union to reciprocate. To our, at least my astonishment, and I think that of most of my colleagues, they agreed immediately. And further unilateral reciprocal reductions followed in January 92. Unfortunately, within a few years, the Russians ceased to implement their commitments, and we followed through completely. One regrettable result is we now have a large Russian advantage in shorter range nuclear forces, the ones of most concern in the Ukrainian war. But because of the presidential nuclear initiatives, particularly, but also the START Treaty, the US nuclear warhead stockpile dropped by just about 50% in George H.W. Bush's term, only 4 years. Dropped from about 22,000 warheads by then to 11,000. I don't think anybody ever guesses. There's one other president who presided over a 50% nuclear reduction. It wasn't Obama or Clinton or Biden. It was George W. Bush. Now, those 50% reductions took place over 8 years and from a much smaller base, from about 10,000 to 5,000. But by comparison, there were about 1,000 actual reductions in Obama's 8-year term. So the formal arms control and this informal arms control is basically how we wind up getting the almost 90% reductions in our nuclear stockpile. What we were doing in arms control with on-site inspection, deep reductions had never been done before. And then the way it was implemented, courtesy of the Congress, was also completely new. a couple of weeks before the Soviet Union collapsed, Senators Nunn and Lugar, Democrat and Republican, remember those days of bipartisan approaches, created something that eventually became known as the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, where we would help the states of the former Soviet Union implement their arms control obligations. And the main partners were Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. We hear a lot about the denuclearization of Ukraine, which was completed in 1996. We also, Kazakhstan and Belarus did not have as many nuclear warheads as Ukraine had, but we had, in the neighborhood of 1,000, 1,500, so it was not insignificant. The best estimate I've seen is that upon independence, Ukraine had 4,400 nuclear weapons on its territory. That's almost 1,000 more than we have total now. So just to give you a sense of the scale of the problem, we can, in discussion, maybe talk about whether this was good or bad for Ukraine. I feel quite strongly that it was a good thing for them to do. I am horrified at what happened with the Budapest Memorandum, which several of us were quite involved at the time. But so with the Nunn-Lugar program, we dismantled strategic bombers, missiles, silos, submarines. We increased the security of nuclear materials and warheads in storage and transport. We had US contractors and officials working with their former Soviet counterparts at very sensitive sites, like nuclear missile and bomber bases, production sites, material and warhead storage sites, closed nuclear cities, the kind of places I never in my wildest dreams did I ever think I would visit. That all came to an end in Russia in 2013 when they withdrew from the program, but it continues to this day. Not active in Ukraine for obvious reasons, but in Georgia and Kazakhstan and outside the former Soviet Union as well. Meanwhile, formal arms control was proceeding. George H.W. Bush and Yeltsin signed the START II treaty in January 1993. Now, if you recall, it's also a whole other era in US politics. Bush lost the election in November. During the transition, the Clinton people didn't have a veto on what the Bush administration was doing in arms control negotiations, but we wanted to make certain they were the ones who were going to have to shepherd the treaty through the Senate. So we wanted to make certain they were comfortable with what we were doing. So lines of communication between the administration and the Clinton transition team were used a lot and very effectively. Also, the Clinton people were happy to have President Bush sign the START II treaty because they didn't want it delayed by the chaos of even a friendly transition, as opposed to saying, well, no, we want our guy to sign it. The START II would have reduced warheads significantly further, and most importantly, banned multiple independently targetable warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles. Unfortunately, it never came into force, and we can talk about that later also if you're interested. 1997, Clinton and Yeltsin agreed on a framework for further treaty reductions for START III, but those negotiations never happened because START II never happened. Bush the Younger, George W., and Putin agreed on a very short, simple strategic reduction treaty in May 2002. February 2011, we get the New START Treaty, which lowered overall strategic numbers still further, but lacked many of the features of START 2 in particular. For example, and START 1 limits on multiple independently targetable warheads. The INF Treaty was fully implemented. It was supposed to be of indefinite duration, but in 2013, the Obama administration accused Russia of violating the treaty, and in 2019, the US under President Trump withdrew from the treaty. Russia later followed suit. So no INF treaty. New START was extended by Biden for 5 years. Otherwise, it would have expired in February of 2021. But it's likely to end in February, as we've already discussed. Nuclear nonproliferation treaty still exists, by and large very successful. Not completely. India, Pakistan, and Israel have never acceded, and all obviously have nuclear forces. Iran is violating the treaty, is still a member. North Korea withdrew from the treaty in 2003 and had its first nuclear explosion a couple of years later in October of 2006. We're now very worried, some of us are very worried about what will happen to the NPT if US alliances become very weakened, because our East Asian and NATO allies have relied for decades on the US nuclear umbrella. And if they don't feel they can rely on that anymore, that could trigger proliferation by our allies. Some people tell me that's very unlikely, but it may still be unlikely, but it's less unlikely than it used to be. It's more of a concern. I've taken up too much time. There's also last treaty that doesn't quite exist in the nuclear arms control era is the Cooperative Test Ban Treaty, signed in 1996, that was to ban nuclear explosive testing. It can't enter into force until 44 named states ratify the treaty. Most of the 44 have done so, but a few important ones have not, and they're not likely to. North Korea, India, and Pakistan have never signed the treaty. The US, Russia, China, Iran, Israel, and Egypt have signed but not ratified. Russia had ratified but withdrew its ratification in 2023. Not a good sign. The Senate turned down the treaty in 1999, and it's very unlikely that a future Senate would ratify it. But meanwhile, we don't have a treaty ban, but there have only one state, to my knowledge, has had nuclear explosive tests since 1998, and that's North Korea. The US declared a moratorium initially imposed by the Congress in 1992, Russia and France in 91, the UK in 91, France and China were later, 1996. India and Pakistan had nuclear explosive tests in 98, but not since. So the NPT, Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, is there, very important. Its future remains uncertain. And as far as the future of arms control, I said it looks very bleak. Depending on what happens with US-Russian relations, maybe a future bilateral arms control agreement would be possible, but at what price for Ukraine, for our allies? I don't know. China, maybe we could get China to start talking to us at least about data exchanges and some other confidence building measures, but thus far they show no interest. Sorry if I've gone on so long. Thank you for your patience. And I'm mostly interested in what you all have to say.
Well, thank you, Susan. That was terrific. I remember many of those things, but to have it all put together in a package is really, really helpful. Let me start out by asking a question. I don't see any in the chat right yet. But we've talked about the proliferation in India, Pakistan, so forth. And of course, there have been whispers that I think South Africa had a nuclear program. Where else do we think that there are nuclear programs that aren't being acknowledged publicly?
Well, no, South Africa was definitely acknowledged publicly. South Africa is a success, a proliferation, non-proliferation success story. First not, and then they voluntarily gave up their program. The conventional wisdom is they may not have given it up for principled reasons. It's 1991. Apartheid is about to end and the African National Congress is about to take power. Conventional wisdom is that the apartheid government did not want the ANC to have nuclear warheads. So they had 6.5. There was a 7th one in production. They opened up all their books to the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's no question, but IAEA was given access to everything possible about the South African program. It was a real model of voluntary denuclearization. Brazil and Argentina had programs not as advanced as South Africa, but Brazil was building a nuclear weapons test site. When in both governments, the military juntas ceded power or lost power to civilian governments, and the civilian governments got rid of the nuclear weapons program. And Brazil and Argentina were like India and Pakistan. If one's going to have the program, the other wanted it. And if one gave it up, the other did. And they worked together extremely well, including on verifying each other's activities to denuclearize. So those were good success stories.
What about in East Asia? We're going to have a chat question in a minute, but let me finish.
The South Korea, for several years now, since the first Trump administration, a majority of the South Korean public in surveys expresses support for a national nuclear weapon. This is of great concern. South Korea has wanted to do something they called pyroprocessing, which at the end of the day, we have really opposed that because it would be a route to plutonium. But the fact that the South Korean public supports it is really quite something. Japan could go nuclear in a nanosecond. They have a great deal of plutonium. Much of it is stored in France and the UK, but it's still theirs. They have great supplies of highly enriched uranium, and that's what takes a long time, or the fissile material for weapons. I am not a physicist. It would not be easy for me to build a nuclear weapon, but I understand that if you know what you're doing, it is very easy to build a nuclear weapon as long as you have the fissile material. Japan does. Now, Japan is there, the populace is very anti-nuclear, and the survey data reflects that, but the numbers are going up. So, and you know, if either country went nuclear, would China stand for it? Would Russia stand for it? I mean, it's, yeah.
Avis Boland has her hand up.
Oh,
So Avis, we're going to unmute
please,
you.
Avis.
Unmute. I have unmuted. Okay. So,
Yes.
Susan, thank you for that wonderful tour. It felt like a, walk down the history road. I don't have anything too much to add to it, but just a couple of comments. First of all, it just proves what I've always thought, that politics really runs arms control. There's no arms control possible in a hostile political environment such as exists now and such as existed before Gorbachev. I mean, we never succeeded in doing anything except these arms limitation agreements, which, but at the same time, I think during the Cold War, the nuclear danger was so present in the consciousness of both US and Soviet leaders, and the impulse to try to get a handle on this really predates by 15 years the first arms reduction treaty that we had. It goes back to Lyndon Johnson when we tried to get the arms control started, and then they were under Nixon and so on. And I think there was always this mutual consciousness that we could blow each other up very, very easily, and that this was a danger that had to be somehow contained. And so for 15 years, we talked about arms reductions, and we got the SALT I and SALT II treaties, which limited their numbers. And I think, first of all, it was reassuring to both sides to be talking about nuclear arms, and secondly, when you think of how we negotiated the START treaties, the framework was there, the expertise, the work for the negotiations. We'd been talking in Geneva for 15 years. Everybody kind of knew each other on both. There was a framework for doing it. And I think what's different now is that I don't feel in our relations with Russia that there's this same feeling of we can't let a nuclear war happen. And that's something that worries me. I don't feel anybody in the White House is worrying very much about the nuclear danger. I'm not sure they are in the Kremlin either. And that to me is really, really the big change. And you know, and again, to go back to the political point, once the politics changed and Gorbachev came and everything was different, we were able to do this massive amount of reductions and confidence building measures. And one should also, in the conventional arms control, the CFE treaty. And so, and I wonder, there's no kind of really impulse on either side to do this. And you know, that to me is dangerous. And honestly, I'm not sure either leader can be relied on not to press the nuclear button at some point. And just a final point on the NPT. It's really interesting in the 1950s, there was a whole slew of countries that contemplated developing a nuclear weapon. Italy, Sweden, Switzerland. And why did they drop it? Well, first of all, there was the American nuclear guarantee, but also it's hugely expensive and difficult to develop a nuclear weapon. I mean, you say any scientist can do it, but it costs a lot of money. It's a big investment in the whole country, and so they decided against it. Anyway, those are just some supplemental.
Well, thank you, Avis. I couldn't agree more. But if I I mean, for me, the huge turning point is the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Right.
and that we came so close that both governments and both leaders, Khrushchev and Kennedy, were determined that we not come that close again. I had the happiness of spending the Cuban Missile Crisis in a very small town in Western Massachusetts that had no urban amenities whatsoever, except we were 7 miles from the second largest strategic air command base in the country. And you couldn't see the sky during the Cuban Missile Crisis because all these, at that time, brand new B-52 bombers were in the air. And it was, well, I mean, there was no doubt in our minds about what would happen. Happily, we were wrong. And happily, we had leaders who were very sensible and didn't listen to their military advice.
Yeah.
However, you know, so you get, well, the first thing, there was no, you know, Avis knows well, there was no direct communication link between the two governments. We were very lucky to have two very skilled ambassadors who were the transmission points. So one of the things that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the hotline, which started out as just a telex, and then got upgraded to a fax machine. You know, it was very primitive, but it was something. And so you've got October 62, the Cuban Missile Crisis. June of 63, Kennedy gives a speech at the American University commencement calling for a ban on above ground nuclear testing. And that was agreed by August.
But they'd been negotiating before with, I mean, that was what drove them to conclude it, because they,
right. Yeah, but it's still, it had been around.
Yeah.
And but nothing, there wasn't any driving force. Right. And all of a sudden you had a driving force for it. And then you've got the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty in 68 under Johnson. And Johnson wanted to start 67. Johnson and Kosygin at Glassboro agreed to start the strategic arms limitation talks, but those were delayed because they decided it was more important to invade Czechoslovakia the following spring. And so politically, and that brings up your point about politics, the domestic politics here just wouldn't tolerate strategic arms reduction talks with the Soviet Union in the light of what was going on in Czechoslovakia. So it was delayed for a couple more years. But no, I absolutely agree that And I think, well, on so many levels, there's not the appreciation. It's been too many years. We've been used to everything being good for so long. And within government, the expertise is gone.
Yeah.
It's gone.
Right to the question that it's in the chat, which is,
Yeah.
given the recent changes in the Middle East, will Iran speed up their nuclear program?
Oh boy.
And of course, we know there's this meeting coming, so.
Well, the Iran has, I mean, we had the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that the first Trump administration withdrew from, and it was not a perfect agreement, but it was putting at least temporary brakes on Iranian pursuit of nuclear fissile material. They have, since the year after we withdrew, they've been going full speed ahead. Trying to think, the timelines now are, best estimate, they could have 1 to 2 weapons. And Avis, you may know, I'm just trying to remember, I'm bad on numbers. 1 to 2 weapons in a month. Our goal used to be more than a year. Well, now we're down to a month. And then, by 4 months, they could have several more weapons. Scary, but also from Iran's perspective, the costs. We saw what the Israelis could do to Iranian air defenses not too long ago, and whether those could be, restored. I really, that part I don't know.
Susan,
But
are there any other states in the Middle East that are thinking about nosing about becoming nuclear powers?
People worry about, I'm not aware of anybody who has a program. People worry about Saudi. There have been rumors about possible cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan for years. Whether there's any there, I know not. United Arab Emirates did, during the Obama administration, agree that they would not pursue enrichment of uranium, still less plutonium production. They would not pursue fissile material. I don't know where that stands. But if Iran goes nuclear, the pressure in the Gulf and money, you can do a lot with money. I'm not aware that there's anybody out there like A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani merchant of death, who was helping any proliferator who would give him enough money. I'm not aware that there's anything like that network anymore, but I don't know.
Let me change the topic a little bit. How do countries that want to destroy nuclear weapons do it? How do you get rid of this stuff?
Well, actually, you got to be careful. We do it. For example, there's a facility, factory in Amarillo, Texas, called Pantex, where they can build weapons or they can dismantle them, and it's those who can build can dismantle. It's the reverse process. You then have to worry about dealing with the fissile material from the weapons. We worked a lot with Russia on that. We had something known lovingly as the HEU deal, where we bought highly enriched uranium, blended down to low enriched uranium, from dismantled Soviet warheads that wound up fueling 1/2 of our civilian nuclear power. That program started in 1993. We, unfortunately, with the result that we are now dependent on Russian uranium for our nuclear power program, and there's a whole program underway to get rid of that dependence. But it was a way of getting safe disposition of the highly enriched uranium in warheads. Plutonium, the best thing you can do with plutonium is bury it, store it, and that's hard. You don't want to reuse plutonium. It doesn't get reused for good things like civil power.
I've been in IAEA, and I've been in the big archives there, which tries to document all this sort of thing. What has been the role of the United Nations and the IAEA in all of this?
Well, the IAEA was formed in, I think, 1955. It came out of a speech by Eisenhower called Atoms for Peace. And the IAEA has several main purposes, but from a proliferation standpoint, it is to monitor civil nuclear programs to make certain that they're not diverted to weapons purposes. So a non-nuclear weapon state member of the NPT, Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, is required by the treaty to have what's called a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA for those kinds of inspections, data exchanges, etc., to ensure that their civil power work isn't being used for bad purposes. Though that's where the Iranian violations of the NPT come in. Not that they're doing a weapon, but that they're diverting or not fessing up about where everything is and what they're doing with it, etc. So the IAEA has been absolutely critical.
You're sort of bleak, I think, about multi-state treaties in this area. Do you see the future as a whole series of perhaps bilateral treaties that would get at the proliferation question?
I don't know how a bilateral treaty gets at the proliferation question. I mean, well, in a sense, the START Treaty was signed by the Soviet Union, and then all of a sudden you have 4 states with nuclear warheads on their territory who are successors to the Soviet Union. And part of the deal for START 1 is that Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan committed, A, to get rid of their nuclear warheads, and B, to get rid of all their strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, missiles and bombers on their territory. So that's, in a sense, a bilateral treaty that had a big non-proliferation component or counter-proliferation, but it was an accident of history. The NPT has worked by and large, not perfect. But we have a chemical weapons convention and a biological weapons convention that ban both of those worldwide. I mean, for all parties. Very broad membership. You got some violators. Russia's a main one for chemical and biological. The former Syrian regime obviously used chemical weapons against its own people. So they're perfect, they're not, but by and large,
Like that.
they've succeeded.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure, Emerson, I'd be interested in your view. I don't see, except for the CTBT, a real role for a big non-proliferation treaty, because we have the NPT, we have the BWC, we have the biological and the chemical weapons convention. And the
Yeah.
comprehensive test ban treaty would be,
I
I think it would be fine, because for us, the political force of the moratorium, we have not tested in 33, in September, it'll be 33 years.
Yeah.
So, and if we joined the treaty, we would have, all those treaties have withdrawal clauses. You can say if your vital national interest requires you to test, you can get out of the treaty. I would think the moratorium has politically just about this, I think, identical power as a treaty would. So you asked Susan Koch, I don't think the United States runs a risk by joining the CTBT, but nobody's asking Susan Koch.
Getting to the end of the hour, and I want to get the last question from the chat in. David Pellizzari says, should we be concerned about non-state actors acquiring the materials and capacities necessary to become nuclear rogues?
Yes and no. That is something we've been very concerned about. We were particularly concerned about it at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. You had nuclear scientists and engineers who all of a sudden didn't have jobs from the Soviet Union, and maybe were available to the highest bidder. You had nuclear materials sites. There was a huge one in Kazakhstan. It had 500 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. We got out. This is a good project, and as a colleague of mine who was the first American to go there said, it was secured by a padlock, a good padlock, but a padlock. No guards, no nothing. So we were very, very lucky. But thus far, the fear of nuclear terrorism hasn't developed. And I think we have greater control over the situation, although when we were working closely with the Russians, we knew for a fact what their security situation was like because we had built it. Whether it's been kept up, I don't know.
But also it turned out to be harder for an individual to produce anything like a nuclear bomb.
Sure.
I mean, there was a lot of worry about radiation, but that's nothing compared to a bomb.
I was just going to say that's the radioactive weapons are a different thing.
Yeah.
That is because, every hospital in the world has radiation equipment and radioactive equipment. And we started worrying about this. We didn't even know what we had, let alone what other countries had. And we're doing much better on inventorying and being careful and developing more safer sources for medical purposes. But it's a worry.
Okay, we're at the end of the hour. We have one last comment from Connie Citro, who points out that Politically, the US Senate is unable to agree to treaties, so other ways of having agreements are necessary. Seems like a good way to sum up the whole issue of where we are right now at 89 seconds to midnight, if you believe the doomsday clock.
Can I
So,
say one thing about if you look
Sure.
at the votes on Senate votes on treaties, they tend to get much bigger majorities if the president is a Republican. And no kidding, no kidding. And I think CTBT is the only one that was actually turned down since the League of Nations. And that, of course, was Clinton.
thank you so much, Susan.
Yes.
And to
Well,
all of
thank
you,
you.
please join us next May 6th with David Pellizzari, talking to us about books, rare and otherwise. See you all.
Super.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Susan, and thank you, Avis. Bye all.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
And Avis, you and I have to get together.
You
This is-
absolutely do. I'm going to see if I have your email, but Trudy will give it to me.
Oh, super, super.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
What a treat.
Really super talk. Yeah.